The night air in Adern was thick with the scent of jasmine. It was the 27th of June, 1398 night. So still, it seemed the world itself was holding its breath. Inside the imperial palace,
A single chamber overlooked the vast royal gardens, where the moonlight shimmered across marble fountains and the whisper of the wind carried the perfume of 1,000 flowers. The air was sweet, almost narcotic, heavy with the fragrance of summer and power. The chamber itself was a portrait of splendor. Silk cushions of crimson and gold lined the walls. Lamps of polished bronze flickered gently, throwing shifting shadows across the intricate geometric patterns that covered every surface. Every corner spoke of wealth beyond imagining, a world where beauty itself was an instrument of power. In that golden silence sat a young woman by the window. Her name was Olivera Lazarevi, 21 years old, daughter of Prince Lazar of Serbia. 9 months ago, she was a princess, promised in marriage to a Bosnian nobleman, a future of predictability and quiet privilege. Now, she lived in a world of silks, gold, and silence. She wore a gown of pale silk that shimmered with threads of gold. Jewels traced her throat and wrists. Her hair was woven with thin bands of precious metal. By every material measure, she lived in paradise. And yet, her eyes distant, unblinking revealed the truth. For 4 months, she had not spoken her native Serbian tongue to another living soul. The last person who understood her words was a servant girl from her homeland captured in the same campaign that had brought Olivera to this palace. The girl had cried one morning while dressing her, whispering in their shared language about home, about the forests in autumn, about the light through oak trees. The wrong person overheard. By evening, the girl was gone. No one ever told Olivera where. Since that day, the princess had lived in linguistic exile. She understood enough Turkish now to obey commands, to answer when spoken to, but understanding was not belonging. Every Turkish word she spoke reminded her that her mother tongue had become dangerous, forbidden, a mark of identity that must be buried. The door opened softly. She didn't turn. She had learned to recognize footsteps, the quick, light ones of servants, the deliberate ones of eunuchs, and the heavy, confident stride that could belong to only one man, Sultan Bayezid. He entered without a word. Silence, that was his language when he was pleased. When he spoke too quickly, too much, it meant anger, and anger was far more dangerous. Tonight, he was silent. She preferred that, though silence was never truly safe. He stopped beside her at the window, looking out at the gardens. Gardens designed by Persian architects, intended by gardeners, captured from faraway lands. The Ottoman Empire was an empire of acquisition land, cities, people. Every living thing here was a conquest, and so was she. Olivera knew exactly what she represented. She had not been taken for love or beauty. She was tribute payment after defeat. Her father had died at the Battle of Kosovo. Her homeland had fallen, and she, a royal daughter, had been offered like coin to secure the peace. Her presence in this gilded cage was living proof that Serbia's resistance had been broken, that even its royal blood could be folded into Ottoman power. Bayezid's voice broke the silence. Calm, cold. Your brother has sent another letter, he said in Turkish. The words struck her like a blow she dared not show. Her brother, Stefan, now ruled what remained of Serbia not as an independent prince, but as an Ottoman vassal. His letters arrived through diplomatic channels. Olivera was allowed to read them, but never to reply freely. Every letter was shown to her under the eyes of court officials who watched her face, searching for signs of loyalty or defiance. He asks about your well-being, Bayezid continued. He hopes you are treated with the dignity your station deserves. She knew what he was asking and what he wanted to hear. I am well cared for, she said quietly, in careful Turkish. The words tasted like metal on her tongue. Bayezid nodded. It was the correct answer. He motioned to a eunuch, who stepped forward with ink and parchment. You will write to your brother, Bayezid said. You will tell him you are honored by the Sultan's favor, that you live in comfort beyond anything you knew in Serbia, and that you hope he will serve the empire with equal devotion. Each sentence was a blade. She understood exactly what her letter would become: propaganda. proof that even the proud daughter of Prince Lazar had surrendered and found happiness in submission. Her words would be read by nobles across Serbia as warning: resistance is useless. Olivera took the quill. Her hand did not tremble. She had learned how not to let it. And yet, the cruelty of this moment was not unique. It was systematic part of an empire that turned human lives into instruments of power with surgical precision. The silks, the jewels, the gardens, all real, all deliberate. Every comfort existed to disguise captivity, to confuse the mind, to make obedience feel like survival. Tonight, she would begin to understand how such a system functioned, how identity could be broken, reshaped, and used, how an empire could conquer not only land, but the human soul. Before we return to that chamber in Edirne, let us step back to the field where it all began. The Battle of Kosovo, June 15, 1389, the feast day of Stiti Vitus. Dawn to dusk, the plains ran red with blood. Serbian, Bosnian, and Balkan forces clashed with the armies of Sultan Murad by sunset. Both commanders lay dead. No one truly won the battle, but Serbia lost everything that followed. The nobles, seeing the Ottoman army still strong, began to negotiate. Within months, treaties were signed. Serbia became a vassal state, independent in name, enslaved in fact. These treaties demanded tribute, loyalty, and daughters. For centuries, royal marriages had sealed alliances. But the Ottomans were not seeking alliances. Their marriages were hierarchies, visual proof of who ruled and who obeyed. Olivera was 18 when her name was written into those negotiations. She was not a bride. She was a message, a symbol of Serbia's defeat wrapped in silk. Her journey from the hills of Serbia to the palace of Edirne was documented by both sides. Serbian chronicles called it tragedy. Ottoman records called it diplomacy. Both were right. She entered the imperial harem in the early months of 1390, a world of rules, hierarchies, and whispers. The harem was not what outsiders imagine. It was not a den of pleasure, but a machine of politics, a world where every woman had a function, and every gesture was measured. At its peak, it was an empire within an empire. The Sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan, ruled its inner workings like a prime minister. Beneath her were wives, favorites, concubines, servants, each with a carefully ranked title, each governed by laws that determined what they could wear, where they could walk, even how they could dream. Olivera entered this labyrinth at an uncertain rank, too noble to be treated as a slave, yet too foreign to be trusted. The other women knew what she represented, proof that even princesses could be conquered. Bayezid himself, only 33 at the time, was called Yildirim, the Thunderbolt. His armies moved like storms across the Balkans and Anatolia. He was as brilliant as he was ruthless, and he understood symbolism better than any general. Possessing Olivera sent a message more powerful than any victory on the battlefield. To Serbia, it said, "You belong to me." To Europe, it said, "The Ottomans can take your daughters, your lands, your future." The harem, then, was not a private pleasure. It was a political statement rendered in flesh and silk. Olivera would soon learn its language, the unspoken code of survival. She would learn how power disguised itself as kindness, how cruelty could be wrapped in comfort, and how silence could become its own kind of rebellion. This was the beginning of a story that would last 32 years, a life lived between compliance and defiance, between two names, two identities, and two worlds. And yet, beneath the beauty lay purpose. The first 60 days were a slow erasure. When Olivera entered the imperial harem of Edirne, she stepped into a world that functioned like a living organism, breathing, watching, whispering. It was not chaos, it was precision, an empire contained within marble walls. Every gesture, every silence, every thread of silk served a purpose. Her chambers had been prepared weeks before her arrival. Carpets from Persia softened the marble floors. Walls were draped with silks so fine they seemed to breathe when touched. Low tables held bowls of pomegranates and gold-inlaid mirrors. The abundance was staggering and deliberate. Luxury here was a weapon. It wasn't meant to comfort. It was meant to confuse, to make a woman question whether she was prisoner or guest, captive or queen. The morning after her arrival, a woman entered her chamber. She was older, with calm, assessing eyes, the kind that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. "My name is Humia," she said in Turkish. "I will be your instructor." Humia had been in the harem for 23 years. She had come as a captured girl and risen to a position of authority, the quiet, watchful kind that required no crown. Her first lesson was language. "You will speak only Turkish within these walls," she said, her tone soft but absolute. "Serbian is forbidden. The language of your past ends at the harem gates." Olivera instinctively began to respond in her mother tongue. Humia lifted a single hand and the air froze. "In Turkish," she repeated, "begin now." That was the beginning of the end of Olivera's language, the slow dismantling of her inner world. Every command, every word she learned in Turkish pulled her further from the sound of home. Language, Humia explained, was not simply words. It was identity. And identity was something the harem could not allow her to keep. Weeks turned into rituals. Humia trained her in posture, tone, and movement. "How to walk," she said. "How to lower your gaze. How to meet the eyes of those above you, and how not to." She was taught how to sit in stillness without appearing defiant. How to breathe through fear. How to smile when every instinct screamed not to. "You are not a princess here," Humia reminded her. "That identity was left in Serbia. Here, you're what the Sultan defines you to be. Everything you were before, every story, every word is now irrelevant." The words struck deeper than any blow. Olivera realized the harem was not built from stone and silk. It was built from rules. Rules that wrapped around her like invisible chains. By the third week, her lessons expanded. Humia began teaching her the ways of Ottoman court culture, poetry, conversation, and music. She learned the verses of Rumi, the cadences of Persian song, the etiquette of the imperial elite. The education was exquisite, intoxicating even. It awakened parts of her mind she hadn't known existed. And yet, beneath the beauty lay purpose. Every new skill made her more valuable, more refined as an ornament in the Sultan's court. Her education was not meant to free her mind. It was meant to sharpen her usefulness. By the fourth week, the lessons turned physical. The harem's bathhouses vast, perfumed halls of marble became part of her new existence. There she learned how to prepare for summons that might come at any hour. How to cleanse with oils of jasmine and rosewater. How to perfume the body. How to dress in layers of silk so soft they made the skin seem unreal. "The Sultan expects perfection," Humia said one morning as steam curled around them. "Not natural perfection, cultivated perfection. You are now imperial property. Your body must reflect that." The statement was delivered like a law of nature. Olivera understood. Her body no longer belonged to her. It was maintained, managed, and perfected like one of the palace's priceless mosaics. In the fifth week, Humia began preparing her for what could not be avoided. She spoke of the Sultan's summons in clinical terms, as though describing the operations of a machine. "There is no refusal," she said. "Refusal is not a concept here. You serve as commanded. Resistance harms only you. The Sultan does not need your consent. He requires your function." Humia did not threaten. She didn't need to. The lesson was delivered in the faces of women who had refused. Women who now scrubbed marble floors in silence, stripped of jewels and titles. By the sixth week, Olivera was permitted to spend time among the others. The courtyard of the harem was an illusion of peace. Fountains murmured softly, peacocks wandered among olive trees, and laughter drifted like birdsong. But beneath it all, there was tension, a hierarchy woven as tightly as silk thread. It was here she met Theodora, Greek woman of quiet grace and weary eyes. She had been taken from Byzantine lands years before, another princess repurposed into a symbol of conquest. "You will hate yourself," Theodora said one afternoon, in the shade of a marble colonnade. Her Turkish was perfect, her Greek accent long erased. "The hatred never leaves. You only learn to live around it. Some days, you forget it for a while. Other days, It's all you can taste. Olivera stared at her. Does it get easier? No, Theodora said simply. You get stronger. That's not the same thing. It was the first time someone had spoken to her honestly. The first time she saw herself reflected in another's pain. By the 7th week, Olivera was summoned before the Valide Sultan, Bayezid's mother, the matriarch, who ruled the harem, with the calm certainty of law itself. The ceremony was a performance of submission. Olivera bowed low, spoke in Turkish, recited words she barely understood. You understand your purpose? The Valide Sultan asked. Yes, my lady. You will bring honor through obedience. You will prove to your brother and to your people that resistance is folly. You will show that submission is rewarded with comfort. Do you accept this? Acceptance was not a choice, but the ritual required her to say it. I accept. And with that, her transformation was sealed. It was the 8th week when the inevitable came. At sunset, a eunuch appeared at Olivera's door. His expression was empty, the practiced neutrality of someone who had long since separated duty from conscience. The Sultan requests your presence after evening prayer, he said. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Humia had prepared her for this moment with the precision that bordered on cruelty. She knew every step of what would follow. She also knew that knowledge did not make it easier. The bathhouse awaited her again, fragrant with rosewater and smoke. Servants moved around her like shadows, washing, anointing, dressing. Her hair was brushed until it shone. The silks chosen for her were white and gold, the colors of purity and submission. Theodora came to her side, her movements gentle and deliberate. Without words, she arranged Olivera's hair, traced kohl around her eyes, and fastened the final clasp of her gown. When their eyes met in the mirror, Theodora whispered, "The first time is always the worst. After that, you only survive." Olivera wanted to thank her. She couldn't. Her throat had closed. The eunuch returned. It was time. The walk to the Sultan's chamber was short, yet it felt endless. Corridors gleamed with lamplight, and the sound of her own heartbeat drowned out the whisper of her silk slippers. Guards stood motionless as she passed, living statues of obedience. The door before her was carved walnut inlaid with ivory. The eunuch knocked once, waited, and then gestured for her to enter. Inside, the Sultan's private chamber was smaller than she had imagined. A table of fruit and wine, cushions embroidered with golden thread. The air smelled of sandalwood. Bayezid sat by the window reading a book. He looked up and gestured to the table. "Sit," he said. "We will dine first." It was not what she expected. She had prepared herself for command, for immediacy. Instead, there was civility, and that civility was far more disarming. He asked about her homeland, about her education, about the language she once spoke. His questions were curious, even kind. But kindness from a conqueror is the cruelest weapon of all. It invites you to forget. When the meal ended, the conversation ended too. Bayezid stood and moved toward the bed. The air changed. The moment had come. Olivera followed, her movements precise, the same precision Humia had drilled into her for weeks. She did not tremble. She did not cry. She simply obeyed. There was no brutality that night, no violence, only inevitability. That was what made it worse. Bayezid's touch was gentle, his tone calm, but every breath, every movement was a reminder that her body no longer belonged to her. It was property, function, tribute. To survive, Olivera's mind separated from her body. She thought of the geometric patterns carved into the ceiling, of the wind in the gardens, of anything but this moment. She floated above herself, watching from somewhere distant. When it was over, the Sultan dismissed her with quiet courtesy. "You have done well," he said simply as if evaluating performance. The eunuch escorted her back through the same corridors. The palace was silent except for the echo of their footsteps. Theodora was waiting in her chamber. Without a word, she helped Olivera bathe again, cleansing away perfumes, oils, and the illusion of choice. When they finished, they sat together in silence. "The first time is the hardest," Theodora said softly. "Not because it gets better, but because after the first, you know exactly what to expect." Olivera didn't answer. There was nothing to say. That night, she stared at her reflection in the bronze mirror. The woman looking back was no longer the daughter of Prince Lazar. Her Serbian silks were gone. Her language was gone. Even her name had begun to fade in the echo of her thoughts. In its place stood Despina Hatun, the name the Ottomans would one day record in their chronicles. She had become both captive and symbol, not just for the Sultan's pleasure, but for his empire's message to the world. 3 months passed. Seasons shifted over the palace gardens, but inside the harem, time moved in circles measured not by calendars, but by summons, silences, and rumors. Then, one morning, the quiet cracked. News traveled through corridors faster than footsteps. Serbian ambassadors had arrived in Edirne. Bayezid would receive them in the grand audience hall. They came to negotiate tribute, taxes, and obedience. But the Sultan had prepared something far more devastating than diplomacy. He ordered that certain women of the harem attend the audience and act unheard of. The women were dressed in silks and jewels, arranged like living trophies. At the center of them all stood Olivera, radiant in gold embroidery, her hair woven with sapphires, her face composed into perfect serenity. When the Serbian delegation entered the throne room, the moment froze. Among them were men who had once served her father, men who had seen her as a child in the halls of Kruvac. Now, they stood beneath Ottoman banners, staring at their princess dressed as the Sultan's consort. Bayezid sat high on his dais, the thunderbolt turned emperor. He let the silence burn for a full minute before speaking. "Your princess finds life here agreeable," he said at last, his voice smooth as oil. "She has embraced her new circumstances. Perhaps this will show you the wisdom of cooperation." The words were simple. The meaning was ruin. Olivera felt every gaze upon her. She had been instructed exactly what to do. Smile softly, gracefully, as though content. So she smiled. Inside, something shattered. The men before her bowed. One could not meet her eyes. Another trembled so visibly that the guards shifted uneasily. They understood. She understood. This was not an audience. It was a weaponized humiliation, a display of conquest made flesh. The meeting continued with elaborate ceremony, tribute agreements, trade routes, formal words of loyalty, all discussed beneath the watchful eyes of the captive princess. Every concession the envoys made, they made under her silent witness. When it was over, Bayezid dismissed the room. Olivera was escorted back to the harem, her face still frozen in its practiced mask. Only when she reached her chamber did she collapse onto the floor, breath shaking, hands pressed to her face. Theodora found her there as the lamps dimmed. "They made you perform," Theodora said quietly. "I smiled at them," Olivera whispered. "At men who knew my father. I smiled while they broke what was left of Serbia." Theodora nodded, her eyes heavy. "That is what we are. Not companions. Not wives, we are weapons. Our comfort is the armor that hides our purpose." The realization struck Olivera like lightning. Her life, her beauty, her obedience, none of it was personal. She was an instrument of psychological warfare, designed to send a message that no army could deliver. Even the proudest blood could be tamed, perfumed, and made to smile. From that day, she began to see her captivity differently. The horror was not in the violence. It was in the performance, the constant requirement to act grateful for chains woven from silk. The letters from her brother resumed soon after. Each arrived through officials who studied her face as she read. Stefan wrote of crops and weather, of governance and faith. Between the lines, she could sense his desperation, his need to keep her human in a world that demanded she become a symbol. She was allowed to write back, under supervision. A scribe sat beside her. The Valide Sultan reviewed every word before sealing it. So, Olivera learned to write in 2 languages at once, the visible and the invisible. Her letters praised Ottoman gardens and poetry. Beneath the polite phrases, she wove coded resistance. She mentioned church windows whose light reminded her of home. She described geometric mosaics that resembled Serbian icons. Stefan would understand. She still remembered. The harem staff saw only graceful obedience. Her brother saw a heartbeat. And so began the second life of Olivera Lazarevi, the silent rebel, the woman who fought an empire with metaphors and memory. Time in the harem was measured not by calendars, but by repetition. Mornings of prayer and quiet, afternoons of embroidery, poetry, or music, evenings waiting for a summons that might never come. The stillness was deceptive, it had constant calculation. Olivera became known among the women as the honest one. New arrivals came from every conquered land: Greeks, Bulgarians, Armenians, Hungarians. She told them the truth. Others would not. This place rewards obedience, she said, but never mistake obedience for safety. Her bluntness earned respect and suspicion. Some women found hope in her words. Others feared she invited trouble. She didn't care. Speaking truth, however quietly, was a form of freedom. Years blurred together. 1392. 1393. 1394. Empires expanded. Armies marched. Sultans celebrated victories, but inside the palace, days repeated like echoes. In 1394, Hungarian musician named Ella arrived, barely 20, quick to smile, gifted on the timbre. Olivera took her under protection, teaching her what Humia had once taught her: posture, etiquette, survival. Ella asked the same question every newcomer asked: "Is there escape?" "Only two," Olivera replied. "Death or release, and release comes only when you're too old to be useful." "That's hopeless." "It's honest." Honesty became Olivera's rebellion. She could not fight soldiers, but she could keep truth alive in whispers. Her coded letters to Stefan continued for years. Each one was a masterpiece of disguise, graceful Turkish prose hiding Serbian symbols. She spoke of spring festivals that he would read as St. Vitus Day, of patterns in the palace tiles that meant church mosaics. It was dangerous work, but it gave her purpose. Then, in 1398, a new concubine arrived, a Circassian girl named Hafsa, only 18 and impossibly beautiful. Within weeks, Bayezid was captivated. The hierarchy shifted overnight. Where Hafsa walked, silence followed. Where she spoke, others listened. At first, Olivera observed, without envy. Age had given her a strange safety. She was no longer desirable enough to be summoned often. But Hafsa's ambition soon made her dangerous. One afternoon, she approached Olivera in the garden. "I hear you give honest counsel," she said, smiling with practiced sweetness. "I try." "Then tell me, does the Sultan value honesty or obedience?" It was a trap disguised as curiosity. Olivera answered carefully. "He values different things from different people. From me, obedience. From you, perhaps admiration." Hafsa's smile deepened. "That is an honest answer." 3 days later, Olivera was summoned by the Valide Sultan. Hafsa had whispered poison, accusing her of melancholy, of clinging to her Serbian identity. The interrogation was precise. "Do you serve with loyalty?" the Valide asked. "Yes, my lady." "Do you still dream of your homeland?" "I dream only what Allah allows." The Valide studied her a long moment, then nodded. "Hafsa is young, jealous. I will hear no more of this." Olivera left shaken but unbroken. She understood the lesson in the harem. Survival depended on quiet resilience, not open defiance. Hafsa's reign as favorite lasted a single year. Then Bayezid's attention drifted elsewhere, as it always did. The girl who once commanded the harem became another face in the crowd. Olivera watched it all with the detached calm of someone who had seen every cycle repeat. Outside the palace, history thundered forward. Bayezid's army swept through the Balkans until 1402, when they met an enemy even faster than the thunderbolt himself, Tamerlane, the conqueror from the east. News came in fragments. A great battle at Ankara, confusion, retreat, and then the unimaginable. Bayezid was captured. Panic rippled through the palace. Servants fled. Some women prayed. Others screamed. Oliveira sat still. After 12 years of captivity, she felt no fear, only emptiness. What was another conqueror to a woman already conquered? Bayezid died in captivity the following year. The empire fractured into civil war. Yet the harem continued, operated by bureaucrats who followed rules even when there was no ruler. That was the genius and the horror of Ottoman administration. The system outlived the men who created it. Eventually, one of Bayezid's sons seized control. Mehmed I, the women of his father's household, Oliveira among them, were transferred like property to the new sultan. By then, she was 34, too old to be desired, too valuable to discard. She became a tutor, training new arrivals, managing small affairs of the women's quarters. Her body was no longer currency. Her mind was. Stefan still wrote. His letters now carried the weary tone of a ruler under constant surveillance. Yet their hidden code survived. He told her of a church rebuilt in Belgrade, of an icon painted of Saint Vitus. She understood. Kosovo is remembered. Her reply spoke of the palace mosaics, of patterns shaped like crosses. Only the careful eye can see. He would understand that too. That quiet exchange, those invisible messages, became her act of faith. The empire could own her body, her name, her time, but not the last corner of her mind. Years rolled onward. She taught, advised, endured. Theodora died in childbirth. Ella was freed in old age. Hafsa vanished into anonymity. Only Oliveira remained, steady as stone. When she finally died in 1421, she was 53. Ottoman records named her Despina Hatun, a respected member of the imperial household. In Serbia, her brother built a memorial bearing her Christian name, Oliveira Lazarevi. Two identities carved into history, both true. She had lived as a symbol of defeat and died as proof of survival. Her life was not a legend of romance, it was a document of endurance. And for centuries after her death, the system that shaped her continued, refined, and expanded, until it finally collapsed with the empire itself. Thousands of women passed through it, most forgotten, their stories erased. But through Oliveira's letters, one voice endures. The quiet defiance of a woman who refused to let her conquerors define her soul. The years after Sultan Bayezid's death unfolded like a long exhale. The thunder of conquest faded into uneasy quiet. The palace in Edirne, once alive with triumph, now carried the stillness of survival. For the first time in more than a decade, Oliveira woke without fear of summons. There was no longer a thunderbolt sultan to command her presence, no new conquests to celebrate. Instead, there was administration, rebuilding, waiting. The empire had fractured. Bayezid's sons fought bitterly for succession, tearing through provinces like storms across dry fields. And yet, the palace kept functioning. Bureaucrats copied ledgers. Eunuchs kept records. Servants lit lamps each evening as though nothing had changed. That was the paradox of empire, it never stopped moving, even when its heart was gone. When Mehmed I finally secured the throne, Oliveira was transferred to his household, along with the other women of Bayezid's harem. She was 34 then, too old to be a favorite, but too valuable to discard. The transition was formal, cold, and precise. Her name was entered into new records, her chamber reassigned, her allowance adjusted. She was now part of the sultan's inheritance, passed down like a jewel or a scroll. But there was something almost merciful in this new invisibility. For the first time since she was 19, no one demanded her body or her performance. She became a shadow, moving through marble corridors, observing, instructing, and, for the first time, choosing silence for herself rather than survival. She trained younger women, new captives, bright-eyed and trembling, teaching them how to navigate the unspoken codes of the harem. Her tone was calm, her lessons simple. Never trust comfort, she told them. It is the first step to forgetting who you are. The younger ones called her and mother. Some whispered her story in secret, half legend already. The Serbian princess who lived in silks but never smiled, who taught resistance without ever saying the word. At night, she still wrote to her brother, Stefan Lazarevi, who now ruled Serbia under Ottoman vassalage. Their letters had become a language of ghosts, each sentence a cipher, each word a bridge between two worlds. He wrote of a church rebuilt on the ruins of their father's fortress. He described an icon of Saint Vitus restored above the altar. It was his way of saying, "We have not forgotten Kosovo." She answered with equal care, writing of mosaics in the Sultan's palace that reminded her of windows in old churches. She knew he would understand. It meant, "I still remember who I am." Those exchanges became her anchor. When she read his letters, her chest would tighten with something dangerously close to hope. Not hope for freedom. She had long stopped dreaming of that, but hoped that memory itself could outlive captivity. The empire around her kept changing. Armies rose and fell. Territories shifted. Generations of women passed through the harem, each repeating the same cycle, right? Obedience, fading. And through it all, Olivera endured steady, patient, and painfully lucid. She understood now that empires did not truly end in battlefields. They ended in memory. When people stopped telling stories that contradicted their glory, she vowed she would not let that happen. Even if she could not escape, she could remember. By the time she turned 50, her hair was streaked with silver, her voice low and steady. The young concubines listened when she spoke. She carried an aura of quiet authority, a woman who had seen too much to be deceived again. In 1421, when she died quietly in her sleep, the record keepers noted her passing with efficiency. The Ottoman archives called her Despina Hatun, a noble woman of the imperial household, remembered with respect. In Serbia, far away, her brother ordered a memorial carved with her Christian name, Olivera Lazarevi. 2 names, 2 lives, 1 truth. She had lived 32 years as both prisoner and symbol, and somehow in that duality, she had found endurance. Olivera's death did not end her story, it revealed what she had truly lived inside of. The Ottoman harem was not a single room, nor merely a collection of women. It was an entire invisible empire within the palace, functioning with precision that rivaled any military unit. It had hierarchy, laws, accounts, ceremonies, punishments, and promotions. It was, in every sense, a government made of silence. To outsiders, it was rumor. To those within, it was administration. At the top stood the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother queen in everything but name. Beneath her were the Cad's wives and favorites, then Iqbal's concubines favored for service, and finally, the servants who cleaned and prepared the chambers. Every gesture, every glance, was regulation. The wrong tone to a superior could cost years of privilege. The wrong friendship could mean exile to the palace kitchens. The harem was power disguised as beauty, control masked by silk. It also served multiple purposes at once. It was domestic, housing the Sultan's family. It was political, demonstrating Ottoman dominance by collecting women from conquered lands. It was educational, training women in music, languages, and court culture to serve the empire's elite. And it was symbolic, proving that the Sultan's power extended beyond battlefields into the private, sacred spaces of conquered nations. Luxury was its most subtle weapon. Everything was beautiful, intoxicatingly so. The marble gleamed, the air was perfumed, and the gardens sang with fountains. But that beauty functioned like a mirror, reflecting back obedience. Comfort became a form of control. When captivity feels elegant, rebellion feels ungrateful. Language remained one of the system's strongest tools. New arrivals were forbidden from speaking their native tongues, just as Olivera had been. Within months, Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian, and Armenian voices all vanished into a single Turkish hum. Identity dissolved in translation. Punishment was rarely physical. It was reassignment, a quiet demotion from favored quarters to servitude, a fall from gold to gray. The message was always clear. Compliance keeps you comfortable. Defiance strips you of identity. Records from the 15th century show how efficient this machine became. Every woman's clothing allowance, lesson schedule, and rank were logged. Promotions depended on usefulness, a word broad enough to include beauty, skill, and silence. The system had its own economy. The harem required hundreds of workers, musicians, tailors, guards, physicians. Entire industries existed to sustain the illusion of perfection. To the outside world, the harem symbolized decadence. To those within, it was infrastructure, the invisible scaffolding of Ottoman politics. But what made it extraordinary and terrible was that it worked. It transformed captives into symbols of order. It turned conquest into culture. It replaced rebellion with ceremony. By the time of Sultaness Layman, a century after Oliveira's death, the system had perfected itself. The harem became not just a household, but a university of control, producing women who shaped politics through charm, alliance, and intelligence. Yet beneath every jewel, beneath every carefully chosen word, remained the same truth Oliveira had understood. The harem was not a place, it was a process. A process designed to turn human beings into instruments of empire. And still, within that process, there were cracks. For every rule, a whisper. For every submission, a silent act of resistance. For every woman who forgot her name, another remembered in secret. Oliveira had been one of those who remembered, and through her letters, her story survived long enough to reveal the structure that had built her cage. History likes to pretend that institutions end when kings die, but the truth is quieter. They end when people stop believing in them, and belief, in the harem, was cultivated like a garden. Long after Oliveira's death, the rhythm she had lived inside continued unchanged, efficient, absolute. New women entered through the same iron gates, carrying the same small bundles of memories. They were told the same words, "You are here to serve." By the 16th century, the harem had perfected its illusion. To an outsider, it appeared like paradise: marble baths, fountains whispering under domes painted with gold stars, silks flowing like rivers of light. But beneath the fragrance of rose oil and the hum of music, the same silence ruled. That silence became inheritance. Each generation learned it from the last. New girls mimicked the older ones, copying posture, tone, obedience, learning to erase themselves without realizing they were doing it. What had begun as survival turned into tradition. The women believed the quiet was their virtue. They began to tell each other that obedience brought harmony, that patience was holy. They called endurance faith. They forgot that, once, silence had been imposed by fear. Somewhere deep within the archives, scribes recorded the household lists. One Greek girl of fine bearing, a Bulgarian singer, a Circassian dancer, a Christian of noble descent. Names disappeared, replaced by descriptions. The ledgers did not lie. They simply erased with elegance. And yet, even in that engineered silence, traces of defiance survived. A pattern stitched into a robe that echoed the cross of a vanished church. A melody sung in minor keys that once belonged to another land. A whispered prayer, disguised as poetry, shared between friends before dawn. The harem had built its own form of memory, not loud or open, but encoded, woven into habits, gestures, and crafts. The empire believed it was shaping the women. In truth, the women were quietly reshaping the empire. By the reign of Layman the Magnificent, this influence had become visible. His consort, Rem Sultan, once a Ukrainian captive, rewrote the rules of power. She advised the Sultan, corresponded with kings, and built charitable foundations across the empire. In her rise lived the distant echo of Oliveira the captive, who had learned to use language, beauty, and patience as weapons of survival. The empire thought it had mastered women. In reality, it had educated them. Within its walls, they studied languages, philosophy, politics. They learned the art of timing, of reading moods, of influencing decisions whispered in candlelight. From silence, they built diplomacy, but the price was still the same. To gain influence, they had to accept invisibility. Generations of women became both architects and captives of their own world, teaching their daughters how to smile at chains so gracefully that even the guards forgot they were there. The harem, by then, was no longer just a household. It was a microcosm of the empire itself, its discipline, its secrecy, its brilliance, and its tragedy. When foreign envoys arrived at court, they marveled at the perfection of the Ottoman system. Few realized that its endurance rested not only on soldiers and viziers, but on the quiet work of women who never signed their names. In forgotten corners of the palace, some of these women kept small relics, scraps of cloth embroidered with strange symbols, a handful of soil hidden inside a pouch, a tiny painted icon smuggled from home. They didn't keep them as rebellion. They kept them as proof that they had existed before they were renamed. This was the true inheritance of the harem, not wealth, not power, but memory disguised as decorum. When one woman died, another found her keepsake and added her own beside it, a ring, a ribbon, a verse, a silent archive of private truths. Over centuries, the collection grew unseen. By the time Western visitors entered the palace in the 19th century, the old order was fading. They found trunks of jewelry, boxes of letters, fragments of songs, and could not understand what they meant. They saw ornaments. They missed the message. Each relic was a whisper. We were here. We remembered. Empires do not die in a single moment. They fade slowly, almost politely, until their silence becomes louder than their armies. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the invincible force it once was. The thunder of conquest had long been replaced by the rustle of paperwork. Ministers debated reforms. Poets mourned lost glory. Foreign diplomats wrote reports about a sick man limping toward his end. And within the fading grandeur of Istanbul's Topkapı Palace, the harem still existed, but now as a ghost of its former self. The laughter of women no longer echoed beneath the domes. The fountains still ran, but fewer servants tended them. The gates that had once locked the world out now felt like barriers keeping dust in. Those who lived there in its final decades felt the change keenly. The rules remained, but the meaning had slipped away. What had once been a living organism, a political machine wrapped in silk, was now only ritual. The empire had forgotten why it built such a place. The last generations of women in the harem were not captives of war, but daughters of bureaucrats, wives of officials, or orphans raised under imperial care. They inherited the silence, but not the purpose. They still spoke in low voices, still walked with grace, still covered their thoughts behind veils of courtesy. Yet their obedience had become hollow. The empire they were trained to serve no longer existed in spirit. Outside the palace walls, revolutions shook Europe. Trains connected continents. Newspapers carried words faster than messengers. The modern world had begun to speak, and the harem, for all its beauty, had no language for it. Scholars later described those last years as decadent, but decadence is just another word for remembering how to feel. The women of the dying harem began to paint, to write poetry, to dream of walking beyond the gates. Their silence turned to nostalgia, then to questions. And questions, once spoken, are a kind of rebellion. When Abdülhamid II, the last caliph of the Ottoman dynasty, was deposed in 1924, the harem was officially dissolved. Its residents were escorted out through the same gates where their ancestors had entered centuries before this time, not as captives, but as relics. Some cried, others laughed. Many simply stood in shock, watching the city unfold before them like a world they'd read about but never seen. The Bosporus glittered under modern sunlight. Trams clattered past. Men in Western suits hurried through streets that had once bowed to sultans. History had changed overnight. What the sword could not do in 6 centuries, paper and politics had done in 6 months. The old palace was sealed. For years it remained closed, its rooms preserved like a time capsule. When historians and visitors finally entered, they found everything untouched. Perfumes still on shelves, embroidered shoes beside cold hearths, mirrors clouded with age. It was as though the women had simply vanished, leaving only breath on glass. One scholar wrote, The silence of those chambers is not absence, it is memory refusing to die. And in that silence, echoes of Oliveira remain. She had been gone for 500 years, yet her story lingered in the patterns of the tiles, in the letters preserved in archives, in the faint perfume of resilience. Her life had predicted this, ending the slow corrosion of belief, for she had seen how systems outlive the men who built them, how beauty can become a cage, and how cages eventually collapse under their own perfection. The Ottoman Empire ended the same way the harem had once begun, with ceremony masking surrender. Flags were lowered with dignity, titles dissolved with paperwork. The empire did not explode, it simply exhaled and disappeared. But stories, unlike empires, do not die, they migrate. When the palace opened as a museum, tourists wandered through its marble halls, tracing fingers along painted walls that once hid entire worlds. Few knew the names of the women who had walked there. Fewer still understood that every curve of calligraphy, every petal of a painted flower, was born from the discipline of women who had no choice but to endure. Their memory lived not in portraits, but in patterns. The empire had recorded its rulers in stone. The women recorded themselves in art. That was the final irony. The same system that sought to silence them had unknowingly immortalized them. Their voices survived, not as words, but as design, color, rhythm. 1,000 years from now, when the names of sultans have faded, people will still see their work, still feel that quiet intelligence embedded in every tile. That is how the conquered outlast the conquerors. And somewhere, perhaps, Oliveira's spirit walks those halls not as a captive, not as a queen, but as a witness to endurance. History is a mirror. It shows us not only what happened, but what we are willing to remember. Oliveira's story, like the empires that swallowed and outlived her, belongs to that thin border between memory and myth. 5 centuries after her death, scholars still argue about who she was. Was she the loyal consort who softened Bayezid's heart, or the quiet captive who carried a nation's grief in her silence? The truth is both and neither, because history rarely gives women the courtesy of clarity. When you walk today through the courtyards of Topkapı Palace, you can still hear the layered echo of those questions. Tourists murmur under painted domes. Guides point to mosaics and chandeliers. But if you listen between footsteps, there is another sound, a hush, a pause that belongs to those who once lived there. That hush is Oliveira's true legacy, not in statues, not in marble, but in the discipline of remembering. The world she knew was built on spectacle. Power was displayed through silk, through ceremony, through control. Every act of beauty had a cost. Every gesture of grace hid a negotiation. And yet, in that world, she found a form of freedom that the conquerors never anticipated. The freedom of thought. She learned that endurance is not the absence of pain. It is the refusal to let pain define the end of your story. That is why her name appears twice in the record. Despina Hatun in Ottoman scrolls, Oliveira Lazarevi in Serbian prayer books. Each name tells half of the truth. Together, they form something whole. It is tempting to call her a victim, but the word is too small for her. She was a witness, a living archive of empire, of the strange intimacy between power and vulnerability. Her body had been taken, but her mind had become a map of how empires operate and how they collapse. Every empire believes itself eternal, yet every empire leaves behind a woman like Oliveira, someone who remembers its truth after its monuments crumble. In that sense, the harem was not only a prison, it was a library. Each woman who passed through its gates carried a fragment of knowledge, a piece of translation between cultures. When they were forced to forget their native languages, they invented new ones, the language of symbols, of embroidery, of coded letters and glances. Across centuries, those fragments added up to something profound, an underground record of survival. And that, perhaps, is the reason these stories matter. Because civilization is not built solely by rulers or warriors. It is held together by those who remember while enduring. Oliveira's endurance was not glamorous. It did not reshape borders or write new laws. It preserved humanity inside machinery designed to erase it. In her silence lived every captive who refused to surrender, her inner voice. In her coded letters lived every truth that politics tried to rewrite. When she died, the empire continued. But when the empire died, her kind of strength remained. It can be found in the way women across the world still navigate systems larger than themselves, corporate, political, social, and find ways to remain whole inside them. It can be heard in every quiet act of defiance that says, "You may define my world, but not my soul." That is the inheritance Oliveira left us, not rebellion, but resilience. Centuries later, historians rediscovered her correspondence. The letters, faded and fragile, revealed a mind sharper than any sword. She never pleaded for rescue. She wrote about art, music, and faith. Beneath those words, she hid memory like a seed. And memory, given enough time, blooms. Her brother's descendants built monasteries where her name is still spoken during prayer. The monks chant softly, Za Oliveira for Oliveira. Each syllable travels across 500 years of silence, breaking it gently, turning captivity into story. When the modern world romanticizes palaces and harems, it forgets that behind every jeweled wall stood a mind counting its own survival in breaths and sentences. The beauty was real, but so was the cost. If you stand in those marble corridors today, you will notice how the architecture repeats itself, arches within arches, rooms within rooms. That was by design, a metaphor for containment. But look closer, and you will see something else: imperfection. Tiny asymmetries in the tiles, deliberate flaws added by artisans who believed that only God could create perfection. Those flaws are where truth hides. They are small rebellions in stone, just as Oliveira's letters were small rebellions in ink. Each one whispers, perfection is the language of power. Imperfection is the language of humanity. The empire that once ruled continents collapsed into republics. Its palaces became museums. Its rulers became portraits. But the stories of its women, still delicate, still echoing, survived because they were never fully erased. Oliveira's life reminds us that history is not about who conquered whom, but about who remained human when conquest was complete. She reminds us that silence can be both a weapon and a wound, that obedience can hide endurance, and that memory, soft, persistent, invisible, is the most dangerous form of freedom. If the stones of Edirne and Istanbul could speak, they would not tell tales of armies. They would tell of footsteps in the night, of whispered prayers, of ink drying slowly under candlelight. They would tell of a woman who refused to let her conqueror decide the final shape of her story. And perhaps that is how history heals, not through glory, but through recollection. When we remember Oliveira, we are not only remembering her pain, we are acknowledging her mastery over it. She turned obedience into endurance, endurance into meaning, and meaning into legacy. Now, her story belongs to us, to anyone who has ever felt powerless in a world built by others. It reminds us that survival itself is an art form, that to endure without losing compassion, to win the only victory that lasts. So, when the lights dim in the museum and the last visitor leaves, imagine the echoes returning, the soft footsteps, the distant music, the letters still breathing behind glass. And in that silence, imagine her voice, calm, proud, unbroken, whispering the same words she once wrote to her brother across forbidden lines. I am still here,